Welcome to our quick tutorial on how to extend an app to include validation. This tutorial will cover some simple concepts in relation to how Rapid can manage validation. For this tutorial, we will be using our existing form app, which we made in another video. This video went over the creation of a simple form app. A link to that video is in the description box below, or by clicking the annotation on screen. With the basic introduction out of the way, let's begin by jumping into our app. Firstly, let's familiarize ourselves with this page, as it already has everything we need to start making our validation. If you are already familiar with this page, either from watching our forms video or by making this app yourself, feel free to skip this part of the video. This page consists of 5 text controls, 3 input controls, 1 date control, 1 button, and 2 styled panels. The button on this page has a navigation action that displays another page as a dialog. That about covers the core principles of this page, along with its mechanics. Now let's move on to the validation. To begin, we will be clicking on our first name input box. Here we can see the validation drop-down. When clicking on the drop-down, we can see a variety of different options. With the drop-down open, it is worth going over a few of the different options available. Any value is the default one to go for when handling text. Number is used for when we want a negative number, a number with decimal places, or a standard number. Integer is for whole numbers only. The different date formats are used for the date control. Currency is for when you want to deal with values in money that support up to 2 decimal places. Email is for the standard email address format, which we will cover in some detail later on. The last 2 are slightly more specialist and are recommended for advanced programmers. Custom allows you to create your own validation rule using regex, otherwise known as regular expressions. JavaScript is as the label details and allows you to enter your own custom validation rule written in JavaScript. Relevant to this input box, we will be choosing the Any Value option. Here we can see a few more options become available. The message will allow us to explain what is needed in the input box and will display whenever the user fails validation. The checkbox for passing if there is no value is useful if we have an optional control but still want to have validation for it. Lastly, the checkbox for passing if the control is hidden is useful for controls that are on the page but are hidden from normal view. With validation set, we can now set what event we want to use. The click event will activate our validation whenever the input box is clicked or tapped. The key up event will activate validation whenever a key is pressed or tapped. The change event will activate validation whenever we leave the input box, providing a change has occurred. Lastly, the blur event will activate validation if you leave the input, regardless of whether a change has occurred or not. The main ones we will be focusing on will be the change event and the key up event. For our first name input box, we will choose the change event. Select the validation action from the drop-down and we are ready to move on. Next, select our last name input box. Similar to our first name, we want to give this control a validation of any value. Set the message to something meaningful and we're ready for the next step of validation. For the first name control, we gave it a change event. However, for the purpose of this tutorial and for showcasing the different validation types, we will use the key up event for this control. When we test out our app soon, it will become clear what these event types have on our controls, and it's up to you to choose which ones best suit your app. When you are making your own apps, it's always worth testing out each type of event validation if your app uses it. A good example will be when we get to our email address input control, which has some additional layers attached to it when setting the validation type. With our last name control complete with validation, we can move on to the date control. For this, we will give it a validation format for dates. See the format option for our date? With validation, we need to match the 2 formats together in order for validation to be successful. Give the validation a meaningful message and set the event to the change event, matching that of our first name. Moving on to our email input control, we will be setting the validation type to email. As mentioned before, this has some additional features to it that caters specifically to email types. It will become clear shortly when we start testing our app what type of input email validation is looking for. Set the message to something meaningful for our email input and set the event to the KeyUp event. Finally, before testing our app, select the subscription button and give it an additional click event for validation. See the little arrows on the right? It's possible to click and drag it around our list of events. We definitely want our validation event to occur before the navigation event, so we drag it above our navigation to make sure it occurs first. Next, select on the Controls section. A little window will appear that will allow us to add each control individually to our button whenever we click or tap it. It is worth noting that controls will only be available if they have a name. In some cases, we only want to add a few controls from our page. However, it is also possible to add all named controls by clicking on the little plus button. This saves us a lot of time in the long run, especially if we have a lot of named controls on the page. For this app, we definitely want to make use of this functionality, so click on the plus button to add the controls. With this last step complete, it is now time to test our app and see what happens with validation. Save the page and click on the View button. Now that we are in our app, let's start by activating our validation by clicking on the Subscribe button. See how the app looks now? This is Rapid's default validation styling, and it can be completely customized for your own apps using CSS. With our validation present, it's time to see how Rapid cleans it up using the events that we set. For the first name input box, click it so that it is in focus and enter a name. See how the validation hasn't cleaned up yet? If we click out of the input box, the validation will activate and clean itself up. This is due to the event attachment being a change event. The validation will only clean up whenever the focus changes as long as the change has been made. Now click on our last name input control. See what happens as soon as we start typing? The validation instantly cleans itself up because we set it to a KeyUp event. As you may have guessed by this point, the date control will only clean up after we have made a change and clicked out of the control. Things get a little interesting with the email input control. Remember when we set it to activate validation on the KeyUp event, and that the email validation type has some more special parameters with it? Have a look at what happens when we start to type in the input control. The validation is still present despite the input box containing information. This is because the validation behind it is looking for a specific format. As we continue to type in an email address, as soon as we have a valid input, we see the validation clears up. Pretty clever stuff, isn't it? This type of validation is not ideal for every app, which is why we mentioned its importance and included the example in this tutorial. With all of our controls clearing validation, we are now free to click on the Subscribe button and continue on with our form. As you may be able to see, Rapid's validation is incredibly handy and powerful for form type applications. Mentioned earlier, there are multiple ways in which you can use validation, and it's up to you to pick the best one for your Rapid application. Certain situations are better catered to any values with the KeyUp event, whilst others lend themselves better to specifying a whole number that validates upon changing controls. Try experimenting with different options and pick the one that best matches your situation. That wraps up this video on how to add validation to your Rapid applications. Now it's over to you. Experiment with having mandatory and optional inputs, validate some hidden controls on your page, and try out the different events available for each control. That's all for this video. We hope you found this video helpful, informative, and a good stepping stone for your involvement with Rapid. Take care and we'll see you next time.